This war and the agony of its prolonging is what failed deterrence looks like.
The people in this room are the target for war in the 21st century. What comes in their phone, turning off of their power, the turning off of their fuel and food.
We could very easily draw out what we need to do as a society to protect our country and our allies for the next 100 years. We know this, we could put a price on it, we can do it, but it's just not happening.
Fundamentally, we have to overcome only one predicament, and that is our own mindset in the West about this war. If we are able to clearly see the strategic opportunity that Ukraine has so heroically opened for all of us, I think we will be able to help ourselves, first of all, and to make sure that Ukraine is a prosperous European nation.
Welcome to the Honourable Artillery Company. I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, co-host of Ukraine, the latest at The Telegraph, and delighted to be here with you tonight. Our podcast started on the very first day of the invasion. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with the show already. It was created by the late, the great, the wonderful singer and terrible cricketer, the hopelessly disorganized, but most importantly, the much, much missed David Nicholls. Let me introduce our guests tonight. General Sir Richard Barrons, earlier this year, you co-wrote the UK's first independently led strategic defence review, and before that, you were Commander of the Joint Forces Command and Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff. Dom Nicholls, Associate Defence Editor, 23 years in the Army, 8 years at The Telegraph, one slightly more testing than the other, he says. Orysia Lutsevych, the Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Programme and the head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, welcome. And finally, our very own Francis Dearnley, Executive Editor of the podcast, and wear very fine suits. Francis, I'll start with you, just to bring us up to speed, because it has been a week of diplomatic upheavals, as the last few months have been. Where do you see the diplomatic situation 3.5 years into the conflict?
Well, thank you, Adélie, and thank you all very much for coming this evening. This war and the agony of its prolonging is what failed deterrence looks like. We failed to deter in Syria in 2013. We failed to deter in Crimea in 2014. We failed to deter when Russia was preparing its invasion in 2021, and then, of course, early in 2022. And now I think we fail today as Ukraine fights for its survival 3.5 years into this war. And the more we've learned over covering this horrific period, the more we see the missed opportunities, and there have been many. I think that few would disagree now, knowing what we know, that this war could have been stopped probably within the first 6 months if Ukraine had been armed with the weapons that it requested. And we, of course, have interviewed people on the podcast who were in the room when President Biden was making decisions about why he believed it was not the right decision to give certain weapons, which I think could have played a decisive impact on the battlefield. But I'm not going to try and summarize the last 3.5 years. I'm going to try and bring us up to, let's say, the last few months since President Trump came in. Fundamentally, Europe and the wider West made a calculation. They believed that Trump was not going to return, and therefore that Ukraine could expect the same level of support that it had received under the Biden administration. Now, Europe believed that that would probably be enough, with it slowly ramping up to compel Putin to negotiate and perhaps impose some kind of ceasefire. They were wrong in terms of seeing the outcome of the election, and since then have seen this scramble, this desperate scramble by European powers to try and keep the Americans on side. But I would argue, and have many times on the podcast, that this was a very false calculation from the very beginning, because we know that it was very unlikely the Americans would have gone any further if Kamala Harris had been in the White House. And we can see, plain as day, with the continual horror that Ukraine endures, just how the drip, drip, drip approach, the cautious strategy adopted by the Americans has not been enough to break the deadlock. This is Europe's fight, fundamentally. And it was always going to be Europe's fight, even if Harris had been in the White House. But now, because Trump is there, we're in even more dire straits. Now, thank goodness, there has been a cohesive strategy adopted by NATO and other European powers to keep the Americans on side enough to not pull the rug out from under Ukraine. But things are still exceedingly precarious at the present moment, as we have seen this past 7 days alone. A single call from Putin can lead to Trump about turning in his policy. And so Europe has to respond, I would argue, very, very quickly, more quickly than it has in these last few months, if it is not in serious danger of a team that's in Washington saying, you know what, we wipe our hands of this. We've already got a win in the Middle East. We don't need to be troubled with this. Let Europe settle this. We would be willing to impose on Ukraine them ceding the entirety of the East, and we would shake hands with Putin on that as a deal. Now, if it is true what Europe says and its leaders, that that would be a disaster, not for American security, but for our security, then we have to respond now. And there are many ways in which we can do that. It involves the ramping up of weapons, but I think it also is about marking down red lines in Ukraine. If it were up to me, we would split the country along a certain line and we would say, this is our red line, this far and no further. And I would say that we would potentially, even as part of that, be considering deploying small amounts of European reassurance forces in the west of the country to say to Putin that his maximist objectives will never be achieved. I don't believe Russia wants to stop this war. I think Putin is still seeking to achieve what he set out to achieve in the first days, the destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty and the erasure of Ukraine as a state. If we don't want that to happen, it's on us, people in this room and people listening at home.
We're off to a strong start. Dom,
As
the
always.
Ukrainians resist every day despite constant shortage of weapons, but they've brought great innovations of this war. Do you see the pace of innovation slowing down on the battlefield?
Thanks, Adélie. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. The pace of innovation, my God, that's been an extraordinary story over the last 3.5 years. So, I mean, the words I'm about to say, imagine 3.5 years ago, I said to you, fiber optic controlled first-person view drones. I mean, you'd look at me like I'd gone gaga, and yet this is now the sort of common currency that we're talking about. And so the pace of innovation has been absolutely extraordinary. You've now got, we've seen the effect that drones can have on the battlefield. They're not the end of it, but they are a very, very significant introduction to the modern battlefield. The fiber optic nature of it means that they're now almost unjammable. There's no radio signal going from the pilot to the drone itself. There's a fiber optic cable that physically links the pilot to the drone, so it can't be jammed. Well, they have the spool of wire comes out the back of the drone, so it's not tugging from the pilot. It's dropping out the back of the drone, so it's only limited by how much wire you can fit in the thing. And the general metric, the last time I saw it, was about 10 kilometers worth of wire, weighs about 4 kilograms. So not a huge amount, but bearing in mind that these things are quite small, the battery pack to get them airborne and what have you. So that's where the state of the art is there. And these aren't great big things that sits on the drones. They are two sort of baked bean tins stuck together, that kind of size on these drones. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about there, Francis, baked beans are beans that have been baked and layered in a sweet tomato sauce. Yeah, tomato sauce, So what I mean is the pace of innovation just in making what you've got today do more of the same thing, go further, carry more, have a bigger gun. That has been extraordinary. But what I think is about to happen is that the innovation is going to not only be linear in that way, just do more of the same. It's about to go off the charts in another direction. What I mean by that is the introduction of AI onto the battlefield, whereby autonomous ground, air, sea, and subsea vehicles will be able to select targets themselves. I left the army 10 years ago. One of the last things that I was kind of involved in was iris recognition, whereby if we wanted to go, if you were a sniper and you wanted to go and shoot General Dearnley, you might have a photograph of this individual. You'd know what he looks like, but the chap keeps wearing a hat and putting a scarf on, so you don't really know. The pesky old chap keeps putting camouflage cream on. But his irises are going to be the same. So if your weapon then gets to learn what an individual's iris is, then a sniper is able to take a shot even if the human can't see the individual. Well, that technology is now exported onto drones, basically, maritime, air, and ground drones. So we're on the verge of an era whereby we have autonomous warfare to a degree that we just haven't got today. We are seeing the first signs of it, but it's not going to be linear. It's going to be, as I say, it's going to be in a whole different direction, and we are not yet ready for that. We don't know how to integrate that. We don't know what the morals and ethics around rules of engagement are regarding that area, let alone the technology, which will come on at a pace. So I don't think we've seen the end of innovation, even though we've come such a long way, humanity in quote marks. But what we see on the battlefield is so different from what it was 5 years ago, what it was 3.5 years ago at the start of the full-scale invasion. And I think that pace of acceleration in terms of innovation is only going to get faster, and we are not yet able to have a framework about how to think about employing this stuff, let alone what it can do. It's coming at us fast, and we don't yet know how to handle it, and that I think is very concerning, because if you have a low or non-existent moral bar, such as Russia has expressed, then these opportunities will give you a significant advantage on the battlefield if you're able to use them to the extent that the military advantage they offer you. So I think there's some very dangerous times ahead in terms of innovation.
We'll come back to innovation. We'll come back to innovation later. But Orysia, I want to ask you about the mood in Ukraine at the moment. A friend of the podcast based in Kharkiv recently told Francis and I that hope was the most un-Ukrainian word, and a more Ukrainian word was grit. So what is your assessment of the Ukrainian morale? Do you agree with this statement and of the general mentality at this stage?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here. And I think the fact that you keep going and the fact that we have this full room, and I'm sure we'll have hundreds of thousands listening us and watching online, is actually proves all of this wrong. I don't think there is a fatigue, and I think if there's anybody who has the right to be fatigued, it's Ukrainians. Not us here in Western capitals. And the very fact that we are still contemplating and discussing that we have an opportunity to learn from Ukraine, to understand the military revolution that is taking place, but not only military, but also energy resiliency and energy supply, the banking sector, the railway. All of this is thanks to the bravery of Ukrainian armed forces that surprised Ukrainians themselves. It's this kind of hidden potential that when you are really at the existential threat, that expresses itself. And of course, Ukrainians are exhausted. Of course, Ukrainians are angry. And I would say the anger has two pathways. You can be angry and retreat, but you can be angry and act. And I would say there's quite large part of Ukrainian population that is angry and it acts. So every time there is a massive attack on Ukraine, you may recall the attack on the hospital, children's hospital in Kyiv. It was terrible. Children were treated for cancer there. The same evening, Ukrainians raised millions through individual donations, companies donating, people donating for Ukrainian armed forces for, as they call it, the revenge campaign. So I think that that we must appreciate that opportunity that Ukraine has created for all of us in Europe. And I think what Ukraine is trying to achieve and what the West, I think, fails to encapsulate in its action is that the longer we self-deter and the longer we push Ukraine to fight with one arm tied behind its back, the more Putin adjusts and the more the global alliance that is now shaping. It's not just Russia that fights Ukraine, right? It's China, it's North Korea, it's Iran. You see all these actors in different ways. I'm not equating all of them. They're actually fighting the war for the rearranging of how we live, how we cooperate or not between the states. What is the order that they want to enforce on all of us? This war is not about the territory, and this is what Ukrainian has been screaming from the beginning. Russia is the largest country on planet Earth. It doesn't need 0.001% of the Donbass. So if it is indeed the if you want to say ontological conflict, it's the conflict between the two worldviews. Ukraine clearly shares this European worldview. And I think what gives hope for Ukraine is also, and I would define hope as actually Václav Havel defined it. It's not that you think that everything will turn out well, but there's a right thing to be done no matter how it turns out. And this is why Ukrainians are not ready to capitulate, because they know that it's not right. They also know that more Ukrainians will actually be killed in the long term if Russia establishes control over Ukrainian territory and unravels Ukraine, destroys Ukraine from within. So what gives hope is trust in Ukrainian army. It's one of the highest trusted institutions in Ukraine. More than, I would say, 90% trust Ukrainian army. It's volunteering for the army, so civilians who are helping to procure drones, who are donating money or themselves preparing food for the army, making, a makeshift sewing of all kind of clothes for the army, being part, connecting to the concrete brigades. It's not a kind of anonymous war. People know people who are on the front line. But also planning the future, and this is where I think that there's a big difference between Russia and Ukraine. Putin basically hijacked Russia's future. So I would argue that if Russia is not defeated in Ukraine, Russian people have no future. It's as simple as that. But Ukrainians have future no matter what at this point. And this is also very clear to many. And that future is in the European family of nations. That future is in rebuilding Ukraine better. It's the irony of this war is that Russia actually destroys a lot of the infrastructure and companies that were created during the Soviet imperial period. Right now, Russia is razing to the ground these old Soviet companies, production facilities, and cities, industrial cities of the East. But Ukraine doesn't want to rebuild it this way. They want to rebuild it in a green way, in the energy way, a resilient way, for people. So there's a lot of discussion about the human-centric recovery. And I think Ukraine has brains and it has grain. And there's two things that Ukraine is well known that will guarantee this bright future. Brains, a lot around innovation of technology. You have more than 1,000 companies right now doing all kinds of drone robotics for the front line. And then you have a big agricultural sector. And you have, even now during the wartime, nearly 3 billion investments coming in. A lot of companies are reinvesting, expanding their businesses. And I think that fundamentally, we have to overcome only one predicament, and that is our own mindset in the West about this war. If we are able to clearly see the strategic opportunity that Ukraine has so heroically opened for all of us, I think we will be able to help ourselves, first of all, and to make sure that Ukraine is a prosperous European nation.
General, Trump has said that Russia is a paper tiger. Do you agree with that? And is this the same Russian army that you've spent most of your career preparing to fight?
So I'm going to to answer your question, go back to the point that Francis made at the start, which is in understanding why we are where we are in Ukraine and what to do next, we have to acknowledge failure and I would say a degree of shame that we've ended up in a situation where if you just take Europe, so set aside the US, but Europe, 500 million people, an economy 12 times the size of Russia, a Europe that spends twice as much on defense as Russia does now and barely breaks sweat in doing it. It spends it quite badly, and purchasing power parity is a different thing. So it is essentially absurd that we're in a position where Europe, at 12 times the size of the economy, feels in any way hostage to Russia. But that's where we are, and that was the failure of deterrence in certainly 2014 and before and since. And we should acknowledge how unsuccessful the Russian military has been in its attempt to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. It has the advantage of mass and endurance and a certain brutality, but it's sitting on roughly 20% of Ukraine. If it's winning by inches at an astonishing cost. 950, 1,000 casualties a day, and at the expense of essentially over time militarizing and wrecking its economy. And so, if you like, the good news is that we have seen the failure of this enormous Russian military machine. And to be fair, we didn't know that it was as bad as it was until it did such a poor job of invading Ukraine by its own standards in 2022 and since. However, it's still there. It's still learning. And for all the excitement about fiber optic drones and the innovation you see on the Ukrainian side now, and it is really impressive, but it is of its type. The fact is, over the last 2 months, Russia has done something to its ballistic missiles such that they are now evading the Patriot system, which is the only thing that could shoot them down. And they are taking away more and more of the Ukrainian electricity infrastructure, and it's proving really hard to stop. So we should recognize that it's not just Ukraine that can modernize and innovate. Russia is doing that better now, and it has greater scale, and it has significant supporters. So what do we need to take from that? Which is, first of all, we, Europe, we have to secure the right outcome for Ukraine. Not just because we should feel guilty, and we should, and not just because we owe Ukraine because we made commitments to it that we didn't honor, but because it's in our own national interest to settle a new European relationship between Europe and Russia on a good outcome in Ukraine. Because if we don't do that, whether Russia thinks it's done well in Ukraine or badly, if it's mobilized and angry and aggressive and has learned, and it senses fragility amongst the European military, why would they leave it at Ukraine? And there are big prizes at stake, like the future integrity of a NATO with much less US support, which we can take as guaranteed. And the answer to this for Europe is it's not a question of affordability. I mean, the UK public sector, more than £1 trillion a year. The economic strength of Europe is prodigious. We just have to accept we're in a moment in our history where we have to make different choices. And what that essentially means is we're going to have to spend more money to transform not just Ukrainian armed forces, but our own armed forces, in order to reset deterrence to Russia. And the cost of doing that, is it 3.5% or 5% of GDP, is way, way better than failing again and seeing what's happened in Ukraine, where the price of deterrence failing is half of your GDP, the destruction of built environment created over hundreds of years, 3 generations at least of the scar and trauma of war, and existential peril to your national security, your prosperity, and your values. So we should be quite clear. There's no script to the war in Ukraine, and we have the power and the choice to make sure there's a good outcome in Ukraine and it resets the security of Europe. And if we fail to do that, then we'll reap the consequences that we deserve.
Just one quick point on what the General said. You have to escalate sometimes to de-escalate. And the West, fundamentally in this war, has done the opposite. If you told us 3.5 years ago that we would still be here, I don't think we would have believed you. But I also think we would have been utterly appalled, and it speaks to how far and how serious things have become in just a few short months. We would have found it inconceivable that the conversation, is Article 5 dead, is now on the table. That is the ramification of the failure of our policy in Ukraine. Putin has learned that there are ways in which he can probe, and we haven't even talked about that yet. There are ways that he can probe on Europe's eastern flank.
He already did.
And he already did. That in Denmark, in Poland, with these drones, Germany, Moldova, if you're talking about hybrid warfare, Romania, Georgia is possibly already lost. This is happening now. And the ramifications of that are so severe because once Article 5 is questioned, you could say that nobody is safe. But the fact is that question is now being posed in European capitals. And that's at this point. Where are we going to be in 6 months?
We've talked a little bit about innovation, and you've also just mentioned, General, how we need to take lessons and rethink the way we're approaching deterrence. I guess 2 questions for you, General, and for Orysia. Orysia, what does the defense market and industry look like in Ukraine right now? Is it mature to receive investment should a ceasefire arrive in the next few months or in the next year? And General, what are the lessons that we need to take away from Ukraine? And what can we learn given our politics, our structures, our procurement systems? Do we need any deep, profound changes? And what are they?
It's interesting because the first drone operations in Ukraine-Russia war started in 2015, actually. Something nobody paid attention, and it was introduced a lot by a female part of the Ukrainian armed forces. Maria Berlinska, who some of you may know, she pioneered the use of drones in Ukraine on the battlefield. There was a natural sentiment to save lives, you know, and then she thought, why wouldn't that be great to use drones instead of risking ourselves in a close battle, combat with at that time, Russian special forces. And I think since then it has really taken a lot, it has really, you know, scaled enormously, partially because the West was not providing the necessary kit for Ukraine. Ukraine lacked artillery. There was a huge crisis last year when 60 billion of American assistance was blocked. And this is where it really escalated inside Ukraine, the production. Now 80% of all combat casualties are done by drones. I guess on both sides, but this is how it changed the nature of the war, and of course the market responds to that. So your question whether it will be ready, it's already ready. Just take a recent statement by the EU Commission saying it will allocate 2 billion for Ukrainian defense industry to produce in Ukraine because it's cheaper, it's closer to the battlefield, because I'm sure Dom can tell us, you know, every 2-3 weeks you need to update the software that the drone operates. It's not something you would send to Baden-Baden, you know, after you use the drone on the battlefield in Donbass. So I think that we should really look at this sector as an opportunity that will be in the future used for civilian industries. As we all know, wars lead to that kind of spillover effects. And I think the way Ukraine is different again from Russia in that way is that a lot of brigades that operate drones are connected to companies that immediately send the feedback, that improve technology, that say the drone operators say what's effective, what's not effective, and you have, as I've mentioned, more than 1,000 companies. The positive development is that Ukraine is now also lifting the export licenses and allows to export even now during the wartime. So if you set up a company with Ukrainian joint venture, you will be able to also take it out of Ukraine and sell it on the global market. I think the quality stamp that this drone was effective against the Russian army on the Ukrainian battlefield would be a sure golden quality standard. And I think that it's not just about drones. I mean, Ukraine is now producing more artillery systems. It's looking at the innovation in the healthcare provision on the battlefield, the prosthetics industry, because sadly enough, now Ukrainian amputees are bigger than the size of the UK army. And that's the fact. You go on the streets, you see a lot of people who lost their limbs, partially because it's so hard to evacuate people from the battlefields, and then it's too late by the time they get to the hospitals. So I'd say there's opportunity already now, and those who will be there early enough, they will clearly be in the front line of innovation and profit.
So there are some really significant lessons that we can all learn from how Ukraine has learnt to fight the war that it has. But it would be an enormous mistake to think that just copying Ukraine is the answer to all of our deterrence and security, because what we really need to talk about is what war in the digital age, in the 21st century, looks like. And the basic concept there is, if you think about how the digital age, so data and cloud and AI and robotics and autonomy and materials, has changed how we live, work and play, it is going to change and is changing how you confront and fight as profoundly. And I have argued in many settings, this is the biggest change to how you do defense for 150 years, since the Franco-Prussian War. Informed by Ukraine, but it was clear anyway, the constituent parts of armed forces in the 21st century are now clear. And at the heart of it is this idea of a digital kill web, which is essentially every sensor, so that's anything that sees anything, whether it's in space, flies, on the ground, on the sea, under the sea, a mobile phone, open, it doesn't matter. All of those sensors, all the things that allow you to understand the environment, are networked and connected into the same secure cloud database managed by AI. And that database, managed by people, and we absolutely need a conversation about the perils of lethal autonomy, is connected to the effectors, the weapons and everything else. And they were once ships, tanks, aircraft, so platforms with people on them. They are already becoming, and Ukraine and Russia are good examples of this, becoming a mix of, yes, some platforms with people on them, ships, tanks, aircraft, uncrewed systems, which are what a drone is, someone is flying it from somewhere else, but increasingly, yes, the autonomous systems, and that's where the advantage is. So a kill web, any sensor, connected, any effector, and we need to conceive of that as a global instrument, range as a function of navigation and fuel. That kill web, which is what you see operating in Gaza, sees a target, takes a decision, fires at it, 7 seconds. In Ukraine, sees a target, takes a decision, fires at it, averagely 2 minutes, hundreds of times a day. So we know that we are going to create armed forces for the 21st century. And we know, and Ukraine has set the benchmark for this in many ways, you can only do that if you are drawing on innovation that comes from the private sector. They're the people who do AI and cloud and robotics. And you're going to develop armed forces that constantly evolve at the speed of innovation. So this needs a totally new industrial partnership. Mm-hmm. And it means literally throwing away the way you used to want to buy a battleship. So that's alarming if you're keen on battleships, for a start.
Sorry, guys.
And,
yes.
And if you sense a degree of frustration in my voice, it's because in the UK Defence Review, which the government agreed to in June, which we spent a year writing in 47,000 elegant words, and you should all read them, this is what it says. It charts that. And the UK has established a package of thought leadership about how to do this, which is globally pace-setting. If only we could do it. And get on with it. And the answer for the future of Ukraine and the future of NATO and UK armed forces, it's the same transformation. These are not different things. So the opportunity is to secure Ukraine's future, secure our own future, secure a different NATO, is through this transformation, which is a global competition. And let's be clear, we don't own the benchmarks for success, and we don't own the clock. It's a competition capable of winning it, and at the minute, we're just not.
Does anyone in Europe?
No. No. The benchmarks are set by China and the US. Russia, in its own way around Ukraine, is doing some very clever things. Ukraine has shown how you connect the fight in the trench today to industry somewhere in Europe that allows you to constantly evolve what you're doing. It's not difficult to replicate, but we have to replicate it. And Europe is very capable of spending an awful lot of money really badly unless it gets a grip of that transformation.
And this is where I think we should strategically understand that Ukraine is an asset, not a liability. Yes, it may cost us something right now, but not only it will be cheaper than the future war, but also if we jointly integrate Ukraine in our, in seeking answers to these benchmarks and delivering on them, be it drone defense, right? I mean, we've seen how pathetic, to be honest, it is. We've seen drones being used, but the way we respond, it's still the old-fashioned way. And Russians are probing, and they're checking, and they probably were quite pleased in the way that incursion happened. And So I think we have to clearly understand Ukraine is right now the first line of defense. It must receive everything it needs to degrade Russian capability on the battlefield and do not allow Russia to constitute its army, and to make sure that it is integrated with the European Union, with NATO, basically with global democracies, if you want, because there are countries from Japan to Australia that are also assisting Ukraine.
Yes, General.
I'm on a roll now.
Yes.
So in this conversation about war in the 21st century, the imperative to reset deterrence based on escalation dominance, which essentially means your opponent knows two things. You can take a blow, and if they are tempted to poke you, the whacking they get back is so severe, it just don't even think about it. But the bit that we're forgetting, I think, in this conversation is this tendency, based on 30 years of the post-Cold War, to think about war as something people in this audience in uniform do. It's sort of outsourced to the military. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the era we live in now, we have returned to an era of state-level confrontation, which is a whole-of-society thing. That's where the innovation comes from. And the conversation that we need to have more in the UK is about resilience. So deterrence means not just inflicting a blow, it means being able to take one. And yet, for reasons we can all understand, we have citizens, I would say particularly youngsters, enterprises, institutions, ministers, officials, even some folk in the military, who think war is some sort of away match. And actually, the people in this room are the target for war in the 21st century. What comes in their phone, turning off of their power, the turning off of their fuel and food, and we need to remember the missiles that fall on Kyiv every night could fall on London 90 minutes from now. It's just they've decided not to.
You've also pointed out a massive security liability and the fact that innovation in the technology lies with China, mainly, which is an ally of Russia. Where does that leave us in terms of developing this? And also, what is Putin learning from the West in this conflict? And I think that's a question for all of you.
The tragedy is that we know the answer. The great, forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but the great military historian Michael Howard said that you can't build your military against every threat. You will just bankrupt the entire country if you try and cater for every single threat. He said the answer in peacetime is to build a military that's good enough, pointing in roughly the right direction that you think the threat's coming from, and then when it reveals itself, you are in a good enough place to quickly sort of slightly adjust things to go and face what the real threat is. Well, we now know what the real threat is. We literally have it on our doorstep in the form of Russia. We see what's coming down the tracks in terms of technology, and we see the might of the industrial might of China and what could happen there. So we now know what the answer is. We know what the threat's going to be. We could very easily draw out what we need to do as a society to protect our country and our allies for the next 100 years, let's say. We know this. We could put a price on it. We can do it. But it's just not happening. There's just not that breakthrough. In this country, the further north and further east you go in Europe, it's a different story. But in this country right now, there just is the disconnect. We just don't feel it. We just don't see it. And that's an absolute tragedy because we know the answer. Michael Howard wrote it down 40 years ago.
So a quarter of all the R&D scientists on the planet are in China. Nobody other than China is going to set the benchmark. So we should think about a world in the 2040s where China will have an edge in AI, and it will have developed things like precision anti-aircraft missiles that don't shoot an aircraft or a cruise missile down at a couple of 100 kilometers. It'll be 1,000 miles. And this will rank from space, through the air, on land, at sea, under the sea, in cyberspace. No one should contemplate in any way that I am inferring we should have a war with China. That would be a disaster for everybody. But we do want a voice in this world, and that means we must protect and be able to protect and stand up for our interests. So we need to acknowledge we're in a competition where the technological benchmark is set increasingly by China, and the US is struggling to keep up. China has 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the US. But we as Europe, 500 people, and I know we don't always get along, we have got to find a way of saying we want a voice in this by being good enough. And that means harnessing our capacity for innovation, which is terrific in all sorts of ways, and then harnessing our capacity for manufacture and for agile development. We've just fallen out of the habit of doing that, and I think this room represents that. That you know the reason we aren't moving as quickly as we need to, we're not moving at the speed of our own analysis, is because the average UK taxpayer does not feel the fear and is very concerned about the things that affect their lives today, and that is. That's, I think, a tragedy in making that people like me cannot do very much about. And what happens next will be driven by events. And the great concern would be what happens next currently relies on our friends bailing us out, and they're less capable of doing that in the case of us, less inclined to do it. And above all, the forbearance of our opponents, which includes Russia and potentially China. And that's not a great strategy. But we are watching Russia learn these lessons and drawing off its relationship with China. Yep. And we should be alarmed by that.
Yeah. I'm very happy you brought in China because it's very disturbing. And I think this is the biggest unknown in this equation, whether China will be willing to back Russia full on. Because we do know that the Chinese foreign minister went on the record and said they will never allow Russia to be defeated. And I think, of course, they are learning from Russian battlefield how American weapons are performing for any future confrontation. And I think that's partially why United States also is not providing more advanced weapons to Ukraine to defend against Russia. They are having that thought in mind. What is also worrying, recently we see an increasing overflight of Chinese satellites, military satellites, over the territory of Ukraine when Russia is using its ballistic missiles all the way in the western part of Ukraine. The machinery, the technology, the chips, all of that is provided from China. But fundamentally, I think China has capability but doesn't have so far intent, while Russia doesn't have capability but has intent and in a way is doing the dirty job for China. So how long this balance will last, we don't know. But I think we really need to get our head around China, how we dissuade Beijing from taking a very destructive path. And we must show our determination that we will not be bullied around simply because China will back Russia, that China will pay the price Of course, it will cost us like it did cost us when we had to get rid of Russian gas in our system, right? Like we are looking for alternative supplies, like our companies are leaving Russian market and a lot of them lost assets there. So I think we have to have an answer to China question because this can prolong the war for quite some time, I fear.
Just one other thing I would add about China. I do believe that when historians look back on the first year of the war, they will argue that there was an opportunity to keep China out. The shock internationally of what Russia did was profound for at least, I would say, 6 months. And it was not certain that they would be able to survive in the country. We all remember the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And there were many countries who were cautious about becoming too involved on Russia's side. You know, there was no North Korea back then. There was, as I say, not really Beijing to the same level that there is now. And basically, the prolonging of the war, our enablement of that, is what has now brought China in to be in this position, where they are willing to shake hands with Putin publicly. They weren't willing to do that in the first year of the war. And so it is very alarming that, because, as you say, the unknown entity is the degree to which how far China is willing to go in their support of Russia. And one other thing I would just add on this broader question about the geopolitical dangers, thinking further ahead. Of course, China is watching. China knows that the outcome of this will shape the post-Ukraine war architecture for probably the next 50 to 100 years. So, of course, they have a stake in that. They will take lessons for that in the Pacific, around Taiwan. So it is in the American interests, regardless of what President Trump says, to focus on what is going on in Ukraine for its own security. But to just mention what Dom and the General said, where are our politicians making these arguments? We've seen in the last 2 weeks alone the fact that this government cannot determine whether China is a friend or a foe. It won't go on the record of saying that. Most of you in this room will know the reality, but we can't even articulate it. And I was reading recently Churchill's Gathering Storm, which is volume 1 of his account of the Second World War. And let me tell you, it makes troubling reading. The echoes, the arguments one hears about hesitancy in supporting Ukraine are exactly those that were made with regard to Germany in the 1930s. And there's a bit in it that really jumped out.
That was before nuclear weapons.
And that was before nuclear weapons, true. But I would argue that it doesn't necessarily make, because we have not entered a nuclear state of war in this war, I don't believe we ever would, that the same calculations can still be made. But Churchill argues that if politicians make the arguments compellingly enough for increasing defense and articulating who our enemies are, he doesn't know any people in the history of the world who aren't willing to pay and support that. But you have to make the arguments, and our political elites seem terrified to do so.
Yeah, very good point.
That's all we have time for the conversation. Thank you very much, Orysia, General Sir Richard Barrons. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. And you know where to find us. We'll be back, same place, same time, 1 p.m. London time on X. And thank you very much for coming, everyone.
And thank you, Adélie.
Thank you.